is all that was, all that is, and all there'll ever be. So he's saying there is no God. It's just cosmos. We find that the National Science Teachers Association say it's the unifying concept for science, that astronomy, geology, biology, anthropology, it can't be taught with integrity if evolution is not emphasized. And the one that really gets me is whatever we see moving and growing around us is a member of our extended family. The mighty eagle and the ugly slug, the sequoia, the grass and the green slime on the beach, all are our relatives. And also what we don't see, the microbes in our skin and in our guts and the bacteria that can kill us and the fungi that provide antibiotics, it's all in the family. Wonder if we have the right to mow our grass, if that's true. The underlying assumption of evolution is that there are billions of years for these things to happen. And it's so convenient that through those billions of years, there were no human observers. So all of this is speculative. All of this are things that they have deduced because they are biased towards seeing things happen on a material basis that would eliminate the need for anything supernatural. And here's the assumptions that underride that philosophy, that matter alone exists without any cause. Everything came about with matter already existing. There exists no intelligent purpose or design, that life originates from non-living substances, that living organisms replicate themselves, that obviously there must be some way for things to continue propagating unless they can live forever. That living organisms have the ability to repair themselves, and that the cosmos and Earth must have existed long enough for everything to randomly form by accident in the state that we currently find them. Hence, a self-replicating cell must arise with the information and materials to generate all observable capabilities. So, how does evolution work? Basically, in the beginning, there was hydrogen, the simplest of all atoms, possibly part of the Big Bang explosion. That matter and energy began to organize into organic compounds, that amino acids were formed into complex molecules and proteins, and deoxyribonucleic acid, the DNA, is the blueprint for all of these taking place. There's new genetic information that's acquired by mutations, and there are favorable features that are selected for survival, and those are the features that get passed on in future generations. That's the natural selection process that Darwin proposed. So here's the test that we're going to apply, that we're going to check to see whether life must arise from non-living substances. This is biogenesis or spontaneous generation. We're going to test whether molecules have the ability, they must have that ability to self-replicate, to reproduce, unless they live forever. That they're fossils, which we find as imprints of there must have been transitional forms, intermediates, to go from one organism to another, so that we see higher organisms. Otherwise, we'd all be bacteria. Natural selection must favor those variations that we find. And since we can't observe that in any human lifespan, it must have taken billions of years of unobserved time for all these changes to incrementally accumulate into the big changes that we see. So, what does the evidence reveal? Can life spontaneously arise from non-living substances? And this question was put to bed back in 1668 by Francesco Redi, who did an experiment with jars with meat in them, and he would find that flies would come in to existence within a short period of time unless he put gauze or some kind of cloth over the mouth of the jar, which prevented the flies from going in and laying the eggs in the meat. So if you prevent that, you don't get flies. But he didn't identify what produces flies in the first place. Then we're familiar with Louis Pasteur. Most of the milk that we drink is pasteurized, which is the process that is named after Pasteur in heating it to the point where it destroys all the bacteria. And he did that with water in a flask, and he would find that he could eliminate the bacteria unless the neck of the flask was broken and air allowed microbes and so forth to get back in and turn into bacteria. So basically, he came to the conclusion that spontaneous generation is impossible, and his slogan was, "All life is from life." So we find no case where we can get life out of non-living substances. One that was trumpeted widely back in the 50s was this experiment called the Miller-Urey experiment. And it was done with a flask that had certain ingredients in it. There was ammonia, methane, hydrogen, water, but they eliminated oxygen, nitrogen, and CO2, which we'd find in our atmosphere today, but they eliminated that. But they heated this water in a flask. It rose in vapor state, and then they introduced electrical sparks on it, and they drew it through a condenser, much like a still, so that it precipitated out some kind of a sludge. And then they found that if that sludge back in there, it just recombines, so they had to drain that off. Actually, those are not conditions we would expect to find in a premature atmosphere. That requires outside energy. It requires a cooling system, isolation, and lacks a source of the information required for it to form amino acids. But the reason it's in the textbooks is that there were some amino acids that were produced. Life requires over 20 amino acids, but the condition of those amino acids that were produced were that they were equally right and left-handed. So you had mismatches. In life, in the formation of protein molecules, all amino acids have to be left-handed. Think of it like a zipper. You can operate a zipper up and down as long as all the teeth are aligned correctly, but you get one tooth reversed, it's no longer a zipper. So those were not the right conclusions for life, and therefore this was not the production of life in a test tube as it was claimed, but this is the trumpeting of amino acids that were produced but are useless. There's a mathematician and an award-winning biologist that got together, and they analyzed what's the probability of a single enzyme, which is a protein substance, forming by random chance circumstances, and they identified that that chance was 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. And to put that in perspective, anything that's greater than 1 in 10 to the 50th power is considered a cosmic impossibility. So evolution had to come from space. It couldn't have happened on Earth. Some life had to be brought here. Richard Dawkins, one of our more popular evolutionists today, says that there's enough information and capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica and all 30 volumes of it 3 or 4 times over. Another atheist says that how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. There's no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. And he's on the right track because the key ingredient is all the information to make all these things happen the way that they're intended. So how does genetic information arise? in order to have any type of a language, even any type of code or signal system, you need the signals, you need the meaning assigned to those signals, and some grammatical structure for interpreting the codes that are being transferred. So for instance, you've read a book and you are very interested in finding out more after reading that book. You want some more information. Do you go after the paper and the ink? Is that what makes that book interesting? Or is that the information on it? Do you find more works by the same author or by the same team of authors? It's the information that drives things. And we find that there is no such thing as a primordial soup. There's no pool of ingredients that were all necessary for life to come about. But you read about primordial soup as the warehouse or the medicine chest of all the ingredients that are required, that if they're properly assembled, we get life. So ultimately, we have to conclude that there has been no demonstration of life coming from non-living substances outside of the work of God himself. And don't you wish they'd get that picture? There are some things that they do agree about in what we can consider to be the trademark of something that is alive. It has to grow, it has to reproduce, it has some heredity from its predecessors, it is stable, it has a metabolism, it has some energy source, it has some cellular boundaries, so it's a protection or a shell of some sort, and it responds to outside stimuli. So last week we talked about some of the conditions for a clothespin, whether it is accidental or designed. And we do recognize that a clothespin is a very simple structure that is made of simple materials, but those materials have to have specific properties or it is unfit for use. And it must be assembled in such a way as to function. So when we look at something like this, an eagle's nest, I think everyone would agree that that nest didn't come about strictly by itself. The nest is composed of very simple materials that have to have some specific properties to hold that nest in place, and it's assembled to function as a nest. So we can agree that those eagles had to construct that nest out of whatever materials they could find. But the amazing thing is that people who follow evolution will agree that it took a designer to put the nest together, consider the eagle to be a product of chance without a designer. How would you make a chocolate cupcake? Do you just mix together eggs, flour, cocoa powder, baking powder, salt, sugar, butter, vanilla extract, milk, and then bake until done? Or do we need some set of instructions so we know the amount of those ingredients, the order that they're done, the process that's involved in all of that? I mean, you can't even make a cup of coffee without some design. So what the point is here is that there are things that are irreducibly complex. They have to be put together in a certain way and with certain materials in order to function. And they have to all be there at the same time. So, for instance, can life occur by just assembling all the necessary organs together? And I bet you we all have seen evidence that just having all of the organs of life in the right proportion, in the right location, does not produce life. Here's an example. And this example is very much the case that God describes in Genesis 2:7, that God, the Lord God, formed a man out of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. When we look at the process, the chemical process for assembling some of the ingredients of life. We find that some of the theories of how these things just happen together don't work. For instance, it's commonly thought that most of all of this is done in some type of solution, a water solution being the most readily available means of putting things in solution. Yet water drives these particles apart. That's what we actually observe. And then we find that there are molecular motors, hundreds of them inside the cell that perform these functions. And they're very similar to the types of design features that we find in electrical motors. Yet it's ATP synthase that is the power generator for the operation of the rotor. So altogether, life, we find, is dependent on information in order for any chance to happen of randomly assembling from scratch, that these molecules can't write their own program. They don't have a blueprint to follow. That molecular machines that actually run the process for replicating, for reproducing a cell. A cell has a certain lifespan, and it must be replaced within that period of time. But the design is that it replaces itself with the least amount of error. And there are no explanations for all the critical steps in all these things. So every form of life points to some need for a designer, and a designer who is infinitely intelligent in order to specify all of the complexities that go into a living cell. So we've identified that life is designer dependent. So we look for now some indication in the fossil record whether or not there were transitional forms, because we've got to get somehow from bacteria up to biologists. And it's got to be more than just a story. But mostly what we find is the story. And when we find some indication of some items and some organisms, very simple, that supposedly lived billions of years ago. Those hydrovents on the ocean floor were supposedly, and that's a photograph of some that supposedly date back to 4.2 billion years at the time of the Earth. Well, God had a way of giving us some clues, and these clues are in the form of fossils. Hopefully you saw some as you came in. You're welcome, by the way, to touch these fossils. You don't get to do that in museums, but I'm glad for you to be able to touch the fossils. The fossils, now there will be some things mixed in with fossils. You'll see in some cases some shells. I want you to be able to discern the difference between a shell and a fossil. A fossil is a rock, and many of them are preserved in the form that we see with this mollusk, where you've got both sides of that marine organism. So if you haven't already done that, please go ahead and try your hand at this test to identify the 8 animals that are depicted in the fossils. And if you're needing more information, the answers are on the reverse side. And by the way, item C, which we recognize as a jaw with some teeth in it, that's this fellow called an oreodont. And not sure what size it was. I think it may be around a large dog or sheep size. In terms of which is the oldest, I can tell you that item F is not a true fossil. That is a replica. So that one would be the most recent, maybe 10 years or so. And the rest of them could all be dated back to the time of the flood. So how do fossils form? That's really a critical point, because the typical story is that as an animal dies and his carcass is deposited on the surface of the earth, it gets gradually covered over with silt, with any debris, any rainfall and erosion effects and so forth, until it's buried, and then the water that trickles through will displace the hard parts with calcium carbonate, so that it turns into rock instead of bone. But so this is a very simplified view of what would happen if a fish dies, or a simplified view of what happens with a dinosaur's death. But if you've ever had an aquarium, you've probably noticed that it doesn't happen that way. That in an aquarium, when it dies, number one, the process of decomposition forms gases, and so it becomes buoyant. And the other fish recognize it's not going to fight back. Now we can get a free lunch. So what remains is not necessarily something that's going to be fossilized. It's still only going to sit on the surface of the bottom. So what does it take to fossilize something? And almost everyone agrees that it takes rapid burial, because rapid burial will protect it, number one, from scavengers, and protect it from the elements, so that it will not deteriorate and decay. It won't bleach in the sun, and it won't be torn apart. And it requires some kind of sediment that's thick enough to preserve it in the bodily form from decay. So ask yourself, we know that in the plains of the United States, there were millions of buffaloes that were slaughtered. So much so that that is a pile of all of the hides of a buffalo slaughter. They went after the meat and the hides of the buffalo. And for some reason, they also collected the skulls. And that's just a portion of the number of skulls that they collected from buffaloes. But we don't find buffalo fossils, because they were all left on the surface of the plains. They were not rapidly buried. They were not buried in sediment so that they became rock or stone representations of their bones or of a mold of themselves. So maybe another question is, how rapid must it be? Well, think of a jellyfish. A jellyfish, maybe you've seen a jellyfish on the shore, and you recognize it's within hours, it begins to disintegrate. And we have jellyfish fossils. So it must have been rapid burial. And in many cases, the specimens that we find were buried alive. In some cases, they were drowned, and then they were forced by the process, I believe, of the flood into a graveyard collection. And there are some examples of fossils. These are marine organisms, but you can see that this one is primarily of a mud shale type of composition, but you'll see all kinds of organisms in these examples that basically are just a collection. And we find fossils primarily in this form, which is different than what we find on the seashore. On the seashore, what we're likely to find will be the half shell, because when an organism dies today and it's not rapidly buried, then what happens? First thing that happens when an animal dies is that it no longer has the strength to hold those shells together. So a bird can come along and open up that shell and eat the organism on the inside. And usually the easy way to do that is to tear it apart. So now we only have half shells. And those are primarily what we see on the beaches. But what we find in the fossil records are the full organism, buried alive. And 95% of the fossils that we find are shallow marine organisms, corals and shellfish. So they're found, vertebrates, for instance, are found in the higher structures. And in fact, mammals are scarce in terms of their record or their occurrence in the fossil record. They're mostly post-flood varieties that we find. And human fossils are very rare. Most of them are post-flood, and there's a good reason for that. Probably man has more capability of escaping, of swimming, and avoiding a disaster that would be oncoming. So man would at least be one of the last that would suffer from the flood and would not get rapidly buried. So when we ask about the power of moving that kind of mud and sediment, we don't see that on a daily basis, but we do see it on an occasional basis with all kinds of even recent events, like this was Highway 1 in California along the Big Sur. And this is another case of a typhoon that basically just washes anything that can be moved by the power of water. There's another process that you might not have heard of, but I think you've experienced. And this is the process of liquefaction. Liquefaction is where the soil gets saturated when there's enough rain or there's a flood condition. And by the way, how many flash flood warnings have we had just this year? When the water gets that saturated, it weakens the strength of the soil that things are anchored in, and it can cause a shifting. And here's some examples. This is a bridge that collapsed when some of the water beneath it was softened through liquefaction, and in that case, I think there was some seismic activity. But there are other buildings that topple because of liquefaction, and there are mudslides that occur through liquefaction. We look at a place like Grand Canyon, and we see the neat layers, layer upon layer upon layer, which are explained to us in the textbooks as being just the gradual accumulation year after year. You probably heard that each of those layers represents 1 year of deposition of just particles, and then we get the next year over that. Why wouldn't that just be continuous? Well, there is an explanation, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's one layer upon another. That let's think in terms of all of that surface being covered in water for up to a year. And guess what happens during that year? We still have tidal conditions during the year of the flood. So we've got periods of time where we've got high pressure when the tide is high, as the moon is exerting its gravitational pull on the polar regions, and the side regions have the water at high tide. And high tide means high pressure. So the water is under the sand, and it's under the pressure of the high tide. You've probably stood in the surf barefooted, hopefully, and felt a sensation as the water the tide or the surf comes in and passes your feet, goes up to the shore, and then recedes back out again. And when that happens, you feel that tingling beneath your feet as the sand beneath your feet shifts. Well, that's the process of liquefaction, because what's happened is When that water comes in, it compresses the sand. When it pulls back out, it doesn't just pull out above the sand, but it pulls out beneath the sand. And it shifts those particles, so the lighter ones come to the surface, the heavier ones fall. And an interesting experiment was conducted that used composition of sands, and they put 4 different types of animals at the same layer and put it through that process of liquefaction, high and low pressure. And the animals that they chose were bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian. They were all started out at the same layer, and after cycling a number of times, they began to sort themselves according to density. So what happened was the heaviest, the amphibian, wound up gravitating closer to the bottom, followed by the reptile, followed by the mammal, and finally the bird, which is the same order that we find them in the fossil record. And we have also laboratory experiments that demonstrate that what we get as stratified layers is not by gradual layer upon layer deposition, but we get that because of sorting according to the density, the mass of the particles. The heaviest get to the bottom first. So fossils basically are believed to provide the only historical documentary evidence that life has evolved from simpler to more and more complex forms. Only trouble is we can't find that evidence. And in fact, that was something that perplexed Charles Darwin. Now, this is 1859, and Darwin says the geological record is far more imperfect than most geologists believe. Only a small portion of the world has been geologically explored. And he who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. You know the Field Museum in Chicago, the one with the big T-Rex displays? The curator of that museum says, well, we're now 120 years, that's now 163, after Darwin, and knowledge of the fossil records greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hadn't changed much. The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time, because the ones claimed in Darwin's time have been disproven. They're one or the other. They're not transitions. So what does the evidence reveal? That those missing links really are missing. They're imaginary. That's why we consider them missing. And the transition, if there was any transition, it left no traces. So ultimately, we have to conclude that there is no uniformitarian change, that intermediate fossils are absent, not just missing. And there are billions of missing links. We can't connect the organisms that we find today with any predecessors in the fossil record. We can't, other than those things that we classify as living fossils. So we're going to move on now to natural selection, which is the mechanism, the engine of evolution according to Darwin. And what we're going to see more and more is an attempt to try to connect reptiles with birds. We're already seeing that in movies and magazines and all the trade literature. And this is an explanation of some of that transition, how a sauropod, one of the largest of all the land animals, and a Tyrannosaurus rex, how somehow they would feel threatened in their environment and they would want to become a chicken. Well, it takes quite a bit for that to happen. And a lot of it was speculated on the basis of 4 fossils that were found in Germany in pristine condition. Have you heard of Archaeopteryx, ancient bird? And it was considered to be the missing link between reptiles and birds. And when you look at it closely, you find all the features of a bird that we would find today. If you apply your imagination, you can go beyond that. But let's apply the electron microscope instead. Can you identify in the top row of those photographs if one of those belongs to a reptile and one of those belongs to a bird? The one on the left is a feather, not under the greatest magnification, but feathers grow like hair grows out of a follicle. The one on the right are scales, like a reptile scale, like a snake skin, and they grow in sheets. And we've seen that when reptiles molt, they leave the sheet behind. So how can something that grows over an entire body somehow transform itself to grow out of a hair follicle? And why would it in the first place? And then we look at greater magnification on the bottom, and that's kind of a Velcro system that feathers have, where there's hook and barbules where the feather actually can be spread apart, and some birds preen themselves to apply oil on their feathers and to make them waterproof. And these features all are to help them with their weight management, which a reptile did not have to concern itself with. Now, we had also some theories that, in the case of the giraffe, that if a giraffe was forced to stretch its neck in order to reach higher foliage in a taller tree, that as it stretches its neck, it actually causes that neck to grow. And it supposedly passes that feature on to its children. Well, as you know, anything that we develop in life is not hereditary. There are some things that are like good reflexes and things like that that might be hereditary. But in terms of skills that we acquire, that's not transferable in our genes. It's not part of our genetic nature. It is just a skill that dies with us. Now, Darwin also popularized a theory that the beaks of finches that he found on the island of Galapagos when he was studying there, he found that those beaks will change from thin beaks to thick beaks. And he thought that was a sign of evolution. This was a bird that was being replaced by a better bird, a more capable bird, because it had a thicker beak and could crush thicker seeds in order to eat during those dry periods. But during the wet periods, the smaller beaks had the advantage. So actually, these things are just cycles that shift with the environment, and those birds never become anything other than finches. They do have some shifting characteristics in terms of the population percentages, but they're not changed. The one that still occupies a major portion in the textbook is the peppered moth, which is, according to one evolutionist, is the clearest case of in which a conspicuous evolutionary process has been actually observed. But it's also been identified as now known to be more complex than originally thought. Well, the whole idea was that before the Industrial Revolution, when you would find a tree trunk, you would find dark moths and light moths. This one's light with some dark flecks in it. And the color photograph, we see that's why it's called peppered. And this other is called the melanic variant. Well, along comes the Industrial Revolution. And all the soot from the coal in the factories tarred or caused the tree trunks to become dark. And therefore the birds that were looking for the dark moths found them camouflaged, but they could pick out the white moths. And they believed that this was an ability of these moths to change their color. It's just a redistribution of the population. And unfortunately, that's the problem. These peppered moths have no alteration other than their color. The changes were due to sorting and resorting the genetic pigmentation of the moth, that no new genetic information was added, hence no advancements possible. It's only a redistribution of the survivors. So this is something that is not in the textbook, because they still want us to believe that these moths are evolving. And Darwin says that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, we've got to give Darwin a break on this, because at Darwin's time, he was limited to the optical microscope. There's a limit to the amount of light and the resolution that you can get through an optical microscope as to how much you can actually see. And so when he looked at the cell structure, he would only see it as protoplasm. He called it gemmules, and he didn't see any complexity in that cell. He saw that you have to have these cells, and they do provide various functions, but he just thought that all of that was just natural. But when we look at the intricacy of all the individual components of a cell, it is complex enough. It performs the function of a city. It's got energy plants, it's got waste disposal plants, it's got boundary protectors, there are all kinds of gatekeepers, and it has the process of replicating itself. Inside the mitochondria, there is a set of DNA instructions, and the mitochondria is the energy plant of the cell. But also in the nucleus is a set of DNA instructions. That's where the chromosomes are for the regeneration of that cell, so that it regenerates itself as an identical copy, because it has identifying and correcting features as part of the makeup. So that's not something that would be formed by numerous successive slight modifications. This video is an examination of a killer T cell which is attacking a cancer cell. And this is a natural function that occurs within our bodies when we have our T cells are healthy and our immune system has not been compromised. So this is a natural process that God has designed within ourselves to protect us from invaders. It's not the process of or result of numerous successive, just incremental steps on the way to perfection. And Darwin had a big problem with vision. Not that he had any impairity in his vision, but he says that the ability of the eye for admitting different amount of lights for correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, he says for that to have been formed by natural selection, by just one change after another that provides some benefit, he said is absurd in the highest degree. And again, he was limited to what he knew about the eye. But as a naturalist, he had the capability of seeing that even in some of the simple creatures that he wrote about, the complexity of an eye is way beyond anything that is gradually accumulated, because each of those constituent parts of an eyeball, offer no advantage unless it provides vision to the organism. If it has no ability of fully functioning, then it's useless. And what we're utilizing right now is the process of sound transformation into something that's intelligible, these sounds. And it's through a process of sensitivity in our inner ears, to the degree that we have not only the response of almost hair-like properties in our inner ears to detect sound, but it also affects our balance. And again, this is not something that comes about just on a piecemeal basis. It all has to happen at once to offer any advantage. So we don't find that these things come about naturally. That in fact, what happens naturally is those things that are selected out are subtracted. They can't be re-added. When we breed a dog to have a limited hair or limited tail, that no longer is part of their genetic makeup. It is subtracted out. So we now look, as many of the evolutionists looked after Darwin, they look for something to add new information. We need new information, something new in our genetic makeup that gives us instructions for changes that we can improve upon. So if we look at what supposedly is the progression leading up to man, there are a number of gaps where we need new information. And we do have a question as to whether or not we are related to the chimp. And the chimp might be asking, am I my keeper's brother? Hopefully we wouldn't put ourselves in that category. According to Wikipedia, the DNA similarity between human and chimp runs on the 98% level. Well, in laboratory analysis, chimp chromosomes reveal an overall genome average of only 70% similarity to human chromosomes. In reality, many chromosomal regions are vastly different between chimps and humans, and several areas of the genome that are present in chimps are completely absent in humans, and vice versa. This woman was given the task of watching a friend's pet chimp, and she was not treated as the chimp's sister. In fact, she was mauled to the point that she lost both her hands, her eyes, her lips, and this was not a friendly encounter. When we look at the structural differences that we and chimps have, we see that there are similarities in some areas, but there are more dissimilar things. For instance, look at the length of the fingers that a chimp has compared to ours. And how in the world could we expect a chimp to type on those typewriters that we had, an unlimited number of monkeys with typewriters? Well, maybe with their feet, they could have even made it a four-footed operation. Can we shake on that? One of the horrible things about evolution is that it's been used as a weapon, that it has been used to bully people. And unfortunately, that's part of what's the scoffing that's taking place against Christians for holding to a biblical creation viewpoint. And Darwin himself identified that he thought that there were that in the human population, there were still savage races that needed to be weeded out. And that was a philosophy that leads to what we would today call racism. So since natural selection weeds out or subtracts, it can't add new genes. And we find that mutations, which were to offer us some benefit, are destructive. So we look at some of the mutations that we do find on an occasional basis. And in general, mutations are due to some cosmic radiation that affects the genes so that when the cell divides, it divides differently than it's intended to. And so we come up with nothing new, we just come up with something out of order, something out of place. And if you think about it, any of these offer any type of an improvement to the organism? I guess you could be double-minded, but that's not going to help at all. There's no new information that's added. It's just a duplication of the existing information. But we can do some laboratory experiments that are pretty telling. Fruit flies have such a short lifespan that we can look at generations of fruit flies, a number of generations under laboratory conditions, and see what kind of effect we would have if we bombard them with radiation, if we purposely try to get mutation variations of the fruit flies. And so we get some that have white eyes, for instance, and we get some that have curly wings. Can you imagine that helps it fly any better? We get some that are blind. We get some that have no wings at all, and that can't even be called a fly anymore. And where we see, and on the left side, if you see on the face of the fly, it has antennae that are intended to be feelers. Now, a mutant version of that fly comes out with legs instead of antennas. Does not serve any benefit. It actually is a detriment to any creature that has mutation, with one exception that has been identified. It's not one that is recognized widely, but sickle cell anemia is a process that affects certain people that have an inability to metabolize, and that's a benefit in countries where malaria is widespread, because that malaria has less of an impact on them than it does the general population. But sickle cell anemia can also be fatal. So if you're a Trekkie, then you probably have seen this type of a chamber that you would step into, and it would disintegrate your body. It would basically reduce you to digital information that can be transferred to another location somewhere else in the galaxy where you can be reassembled. Now, out of your 300 trillion cells that each have an enormous amount of information per cell, how much of that process would you trust to be accurately reproduced at some future point? Or would you trust yourself to developing a few typos in that process and wind up like that fly? And while we're at it, you know that the March of Dimes is intended to reduce birth defects. Mutations produce birth defects. The March of Dimes can do some good in promoting prenatal care, but unfortunately, when they discover a potential defect in an unborn child, what their recommendation is abortion. So altogether, what we find should be the case, that mutations would be highly beneficial. Introducing new features and capabilities doesn't cut it. The mutations are genetic errors, and they degrade. They don't benefit life. So now let's look at how much time is necessary for all of this to occur. Do we have enough time? If we look at the evolutionist timeline on the bottom, we see that only the last segment is recorded history. Everything else is speculative. All of that age, whether or not that was actual time. But in a creationist perspective, it's all recorded history. We start back at the beginning. And just to run some comparisons, I did an analysis based on the thickness of pages in a Bible. So an inch of pages in a Bible is 1,250 pages. An inch thick would result in 1,250 pages. So if you stacked up Bibles, then you could get an idea as to how many years, if each page represented a year. And so a full foot of Bibles would represent 15,000 years, which is possibly twice what we actually have lived since the beginning of time. But if we go back and we extrapolate that back to 100,000 years, when man is supposed to have first appeared, we're already up to 6.5 feet of putting Bibles together in order to reach that amount. And 300 million years, we're up 3.78 miles. You can't get a stepladder to do that one. And 4.6 billion would be the time period. All of this is really to illustrate, it's almost like monopoly money. It's as if, because these years did not exist. How can we know? Well, when we look at the layers in stratified cross sections where something has eroded all of that substance that used to be there, exposing it for our examination, we see all those layers that supposedly represent different ages, but there's no erosion marks in between them. It took erosion, a fierce amount of erosion, to carve everything else out so we can get to that. But what do we do with layers like this? The only way we could get that is if those layers were folded while they were still soft. What do we do when we get trees that are growing through these different layers? These are called polystrate trees. And obviously, they didn't grow through that rock and then turn to rock itself. The tree was deposited at the same time as all the layers that it's embedded in. And it doesn't take long for things to be petrified. This was apparently a cowboy met his demise, and he was buried rapidly, and there was enough lime rock in the area that his foot bone actually petrified. They call this guy the limestone cowboy. Now, the oldest organism that we know of is the bristlecone pine. It was 4,300 years old, according to the best of measurements that they can have. Now, 4,300 years is about the age at the end of the flood. So it would make sense that we would have trees around from that period of time. So we ask ourselves, how much time is there? How far back in time can we go? When we look at comets, we know that they're basically ice asteroids, and they have a short period because they lose part of their composition as they pass the sun. The life expectancy of a comet is somewhere around 10,000 years. Of course, we haven't been around that long to observe them, so we don't know. But just based on the amount of mass that they lose, we can calculate something on that order. So they had to come up with some explanation of where are these comets coming from? Well, the imagination is endless. It's called the Oort cloud. It's this system out here. Now, this is a theoretical spherical cloud. Hopefully, anytime you go looking for information about the Oort cloud, it will say it has to exist. So we're theorizing that it's out here past the Kuiper belt. And We have a satellite called Voyager 1, and it's due to actually reach the Oort cloud in 300 years. Unfortunately, the batteries are going to expire in 3 years, so we're not going to get that information. But we don't know if there's an Oort cloud or not. There is a beautiful mountain in the state of Washington that provides God's laboratory for how we can calibrate some of the geologic features we find on Earth. You probably won't recognize it from this photograph, but this is how Mount St. Helens looked on up to May 18th of 1980. In May of that year, scientists recognized that there was some seismic activity taking place. So they started studying it very closely. And they also noticed a section that was bulging up to 5 feet every day, bulging under the side of the mountain. And then on the morning of May 18th, which was a Sunday morning, this happened. And this is the largest landslide in recorded history. You can see that there was a seismic event that caused all of that land to pull down, and that exposed the inner core of the volcano, and it resulted in a 9-hour eruption on that day. This is a view that we seldom see because this is from behind it, although these people were even further behind in safety viewing it. But they did evacuate as much of the area as they could because they knew something disastrous was likely to occur. But just like in the time of Noah, there were a number who did not heed that warning. And this is the result of that blast. That crater opening is now a mile wide, and the crater dome at this point in time, and this was back in 2004, was 1,000 feet tall. It's continuing to blow, and there have been more eruptions since that time. In fact, this was eruption 2 years later. This was an eruption in March of '82, which resulted in a drastic mud flow, and that mud flow came down and it breached a number of areas where blockage of the normal snowmelt had been constructed from the original eruption. And so what did it do? It carved canyons. And here we are looking out from the mountain across to Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake stood pretty close to the base of the mountain, a beautiful lake. But what you see floating on Spirit Lake are all the logs. That was a prime forest that was reduced at that time. And here we see, thanks to that mud flow back in '82, we got canyons that were eroded. And we can see the deposit from the eruption in 1980, another eruption in June of that year, and then at the top, there's a portion of the mud flow from the '82 eruption. And what do we see? We see the same type of stratified layers that we saw in Grand Canyon because it sorted itself according to density, property density. And some of this tephra that was produced by the volcanic blast was up to 300 or 400 miles an hour in flow. This is called Little Grand Canyon that was carved out. Shows some of the same features of Grand Canyon. And if we look in Spirit Lake, we find that there are still millions of logs that are floating on the surface of Spirit Lake. All those logs have been denuded. All of their bark has been abraded off. And it was an interesting laboratory for going and analyzing what is the effect of that type of a volcanic disaster. In fact, we wanted to see, in particular, some of the logs have become waterlogged at the root end, the heavier end of the trunk. And so they're beginning to float in almost an upright orientation. So the natural thing to do is go diving and see what's underneath Spirit Lake. So these guys are basically diving at the foot of an active volcano. And what do they see but upright logs? That a lot of them are still floating, but some are upright. And we see the bark settled on the bottom of Spirit Lake, as we would expect after all of that activity. And you can pick up the flakes of the bark that are there. Well, that might give us some way of interpreting what we see at Yellowstone, at the Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone Park. These are petrified trees that are basically a composition of a tree, just like this petrified wood. They're standing upright as whole trunks of trees. And the Interpretation Center says that these trees were buried under 27 distinct layers of fossil forests that flourished 50 million years ago. Well, that's one interpretation. But when we look at some of the petrified trees, how come we don't see anything but very shallow root structure? You'd expect a tree to have a much bigger root structure than that. Well, we go back to Spirit Lake in Mount St. Helens, and we see exactly what's happening, because these trees are beginning to settle as they're more and more waterlogged. They have a root ball that has been basically torn apart, and some are settling horizontally, but some are settling vertically. And as more and more sediment is added to them, they're becoming petrified. So if we drain Spirit Lake, we're likely to see the same type of thing that we saw at Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone. And the end result of all of the bark that's there could very well be the beginning process for coal production. We can produce coal in a laboratory in 2 weeks' time with temperature and pressure if we have the right conditions and the right ingredients. So we've seen some of the processes that we've been told would take millions of years to form naturally are actually forming in our lifetime. We're 42 years since the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and some of us can probably remember that shock when we recognized there's an active volcano in the United States. So we do see that God is faithful. There's a resurgence of life around Mount St. Helens, that the vegetation is coming back. Weyerhaeuser is actually replanting much of their forest that they had produced there. But there is at least one fossil that we will discover if that lake was ever drained. And that fossil is of this gentleman, Harry Truman. He operated a camp at the foot of Spirit Lake, and he refused to evacuate. He considered that his campsite was fine with him. He was just going to sit there and drink his rum and coke until it was all over with. Well, he didn't see the end of it. So we recognize the cost of not heeding the warnings that God provides. We're going to look at this in greater detail next time, but we have now seen inside the bones of Tyrannosaurus rex and some other dinosaurs, and we find that when we remove the mineral from it, the calcium carbonate and the other minerals, we get down to the actual tissue, and it is still elastic. And we would not expect that for something that supposedly has been sitting in the desert for 68 million years under freezing and other conditions. Many people look to carbon dating as the way to determine the age of the Earth. Well, what we need to recognize about carbon dating is it has great limitations. Carbon dating is based on cosmic rays hitting the nitrogen in our atmosphere. Nitrogen makes up 78% of our atmosphere. And what it does is it produces an isotope of carbon, carbon-14. So as animals eat plants that take up that carbon-14, they're getting some carbon-14 intake, and they're also losing some carbon-14. So we presume there's some type of equilibrium. But at the death of that animal, it no longer can take in carbon-14. So what we're now doing is trying to compare the ratio of the carbon-14 it collected when it was alive to the carbon-12. And so we can predict, because carbon-14 decays. The problem is it decays a lot more rapidly than some of the other methods for dating things. So the maximum amount of time is really 3,000 years with any accuracy of being able to assign a date. And it only applies to something that was living. So it's only applicable to animals and to wood. So if we came across a sunken treasure, for instance, and we were able to examine some of the coins that were dated to identify the treasure that was carried on that ship, would we be able to identify the time that that ship sank? Well, we wouldn't be able to identify it exactly, but we certainly would get some clues. Because if we've got a coin that was dated 1750, then it didn't sink before 1750. That is as old as that could be. So that really tells us that there are limitations to some of the dating systems, and there are many others that could be examined, and I know I'm exhausting you with all this information. So billions of years really cannot be counted upon to have brought about these incremental changes. So instead of life coming from non-life, life only arises from pre-existing organisms. And it exists thanks to a brilliant creative designer, that intermediate fossils are absent, they're not just missing, that natural selection really is subtraction, elimination of genetic information, and mutations are destructive, not beneficial to life. And after all, it is a young Earth. Just in the last month, The Guardian magazine in Great Britain has asked the question whether or not we need a new theory of evolution. And some of those that propose that question think yes urgently. So they're working on now an extended evolutionary synthesis. All these things really should help us put in clearer focus the facts of life. And I would say that life exists only by God's command. That's how he declared it, that when he spoke, that's the first mechanism by which life could come about. That God created a paradise on earth for us, but it was disrupted by mankind's disobedience. And God had to later judge that earth to repopulate it because of the extent of that disobedience, which was only evil continually in the minds of men, aside from Noah and his family. And Jesus is the center point. He became flesh to redeem us from sin. And although we're born sinners, we're born with that sin nature, God offers salvation to all who receive his free gift by grace through faith in Jesus. And Satan deceives us by appealing to our selfish desires. That is deceit that we are trying to overcome. God equips his church through his Spirit and his word to minister truth and love to those who are held captive by Satan. And we all know some who are captive without recognizing their captivity. It is great to have this knowledge, but I love what A.W. Tozer said, that the Bible is not an end in itself, but a means to bring us to an intimate and satisfying knowledge of God, that we may delight in his presence and taste and know the inner sweetness of the very God himself in the core and the center of our hearts. And even though we did not know God at our birth, we had to go through a process of discovering him or being discovered by him. We know that without him, we would be lost. We would be sinking. So thank God that we belong to him and have a relationship with him that cannot be severed by death. We have an advantage. We know that no one takes anything with them at the point of death, from this life to the next. But we have a relationship that begins in our life on earth that only gets better at the point of death. How did Jesus prepare his church? He told us earthly things in order to reveal to us heavenly things. And hopefully, if we don't reject what he's told us about earthly things, we will receive what he has purchased for us in heavenly things. The tragic thing is that as bad as the world does seem to us at times, that if we trust God in his word, that this life is the worst we're ever going to see. But shamefully, if we're deceived into distrusting God, this is the best that we can ever expect. There are a number of resources that are available in the lobby as you leave. And I would encourage you to grab some of those. And if you didn't pick up a clothespin or you need some more, also the devotional. And if you join me in thanking our Lord. Father, we are in awe of your creation, and we are so grateful that you have revealed your truth to us through the word and through the work of your Spirit to help us to see the illumination of your word. Help us to be the messengers that you desire us to be to this lost and dying generation, to those who might be going into educational environments where they're going to be exposed to deceptive work of the devil. And help us, Lord, to be gentle, not attempting to prove your existence, but in helping to show the difference that knowing you makes. And we pray that you would equip us to share your truth and your love with those who are yet estranged. Thank you, God, for all of the information that you desire for us to have, so we have complete confidence in your word. And we pray that you would receive the glory for everything that is done and every vessel that is made of honor. For Jesus' sake, we ask it. Amen. In sometime in September, don't know the exact time, but the next episode that I'd like to share with you involves some of the transformation I had to make, because I went through education as a scientist and had speculation about the Noah's Ark in particular, and some